Season 2 of the show from the History Channel called Alone. The Season 2 of Alone. This is just going to be my wrap-up and my thoughts on the show. I've seen Season 1 and 2. Season 2 was a lot better in my opinion. I think the characters were a little more robust and possibly had a little bit more heart and soul and a bit more clarity and maybe even skills. I wouldn't say that necessarily. I don't think a show like this really shows your full range of skills. You don't know what was edited out and what was edited in to make things seem what they did. But I will say, though, that I think the time of the year was a major factor of those in the first season only lasting as long as they did. Not that they didn't last very long. It's just that there was a more of an inability to resist leaving in the second one. And I think it was because in the first season, there was a lot more intense weather because I think they filmed season 1 later in the year. There was a lot more wind and more of a winter type of climate coming in versus the second season. They started earlier and it was a lot better. Only at the very end were they starting to get the winds and the cold and the hail. And so I think they adjusted that to maybe even make the show a little more interesting. But nonetheless, so I enjoyed the show. I was a little surprised who won. I think David's a pretty cool guy and everything. I just didn't really expect him to win. But that just goes to show, though, how they only showed so much with each person. And it was really hard to determine that. And plus, you don't know the resources, how they're going to end up as the show goes on. Resources can dry up, as we saw. People can get injured, as we saw. Prepared Mind 101, Chris Tanner made a really good wrap-up of his thoughts on season 2 of Alone. I thought it was really good. Actually, I thought it was one of his better videos that he's ever done. It was kind of just more him just talking, and it didn't have all this graphics and editing. It was just more raw about his thoughts on things, and I really think he made a good conclusion. It was a conclusion that I kind of came up with myself, and it's a very obvious conclusion, though. But do we have enough food in our preps? And I think that most of us really don't. I don't think a 1 to 3 months supply of food really is going to be enough. And that's kind of what I would imagine the average prepper, especially maybe one that lives in an apartment or a smaller dwelling that may have limited space. With that being said, Chris and myself and others, I think we're on the same line of thought that if you have a real emergency, I mean a massive community and state and maybe even region-wide, crisis within your country, it's actually possible that it could linger for months. And as we see on Alone, that they passed the 60-day mark, just a hair over 60 days, basically. David, I think they pulled him out and told him that he was the winner, I believe, on day 66. But if it wasn't for his actual locale and his ability to catch, the food that he did, he would have probably tapped out early like the other ones. I mean, you only have so much energy and you can only do so much on such a low-calorie diet. A low-caloric diet is just very rough on the body and the mind. So with that being said, Chris just kind of mentioned that, and it was good, that we probably don't have enough food preps. And instead of buying another knife and another backpack or any of these toys that we tend to overaccumulate or have too many redundancies, and maybe even be more in it like a hobby than maybe something that's purposefully driven to be prepared, if you will, that maybe we just take a break from collecting some of our so-called quote-unquote toys, even though they're not really toys, but things that we enjoy, our hobby stuff, and maybe get more of our essentials built, our basic essentials of our food and water, first aid, hygiene kits, and beef those up. And maybe even go beyond the 3 months, just because there's real threats out there that could cause us pretty bad harm. So the show shows us basically at the 2-month mark, what can happen to the body and be pretty much depleted to the point that if you don't have nutrients and you're on just a couple hundred calories a day, you're going to just waste away. And that would be very bad if you only had a 1-month supply of food and the emergency lasted 2 months. You could be just hanging on to life, literally, on meager rations or things that you're trying to scavenge around your home to eat, you don't really need to go through that suffering if you go ahead and mitigate that now and go ahead and beef that supply up. The next thing that we saw on the show, just from observation from me, is that, and of course, the contestants were saying this over and over, that other than the basic needs physically that they were trying to satisfy, the shelter and the water seemed to be not a major problem on Vancouver Island, but the food was. But when they did, on the rare occasion, get enough food, and there were some people who, for some time, was able to satisfy their actual food needs, their calorie needs, and so that wasn't a problem. But there was also this thing called boredom that sat in for some, and loneliness, and just basically feeling isolated, and that whole social connection, that whole social need started to really creep out on some people. They missed their children, missed their husband or wife, missed their family in general. They just needed to be with people. And some of them were so concerned that they might actually change permanently from this, that they went ahead and bailed. And that's kind of how I felt, at least with at least one in particular. And I think that we have to look at that as well. Not only do we have physical needs, but we do have social needs. And some people will go even further and say we have spiritual needs too. So we have social, spiritual, physical. And these things need to be addressed, maybe in some way, some kind of plan. And hopefully in an emergency, we won't be alone. So that may solve that. But if we are, we may want to take into account how to deal with that. Lastly, though, and this is fairly obvious as well, but this is the kind of the recap and the takeaway from me, is that how easy, when you mess up in real life situations, it can take you out. You don't get a lot of redos in the real world sometimes. Sometimes you don't get any chances to redo. Therefore, your plan from the beginning needs to be solid and well thought. When you're on a restricted diet, it's hard to think clear. And sometimes you can actually injure yourself, like cut yourself or lose your gear. There's a lot of things that happen that could have been a result from low calories and or just fatigue and just not being able to be focused. And it affects your memory, just being under stress, and being hungry and thirsty. So I think that we need to look at that. The injuries and just making poor decisions can actually make massive and major implications to our survival. So those are just some thoughts I had. The next review is going to be on this Condor H2O Black 10x4 pouch, and I'm real excited. I just got this in the mail, and so stay tuned for this, and thanks for watching.